Do what now?
Good evening. I'd like to start by asking you all a couple questions. What would you do if your town was repeatedly attacked and burned? What would you do if your leaders were constantly trying to find a peaceful solution and were failing, but still wanted to try again? These are the questions that the Chickamauga Cherokee War Chief Dragging Canoe had to ask himself, and then he had to answer them. I've studied this man for many years, and tonight I want to take you all over a quick overview of different aspects of his life. We're going to talk a little bit about the culture that he grew up in. We're going to talk some about his childhood. Then I'm going to touch on a speech that he made at Sycamore Shoals. Then we're going to talk about the reason for the name behind Kentucky, meaning dark and bloody ground. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the Chickamauga Wars and his death. Now, the culture, the land was very important to the Cherokee people. It was important for them because that is where their food came from. You know, they depended on the wildlife to hunt, and they also depended on the crops that they grew on the land. The land supplied everything they needed. It supplied their food, materials for their shelter, and it also supplied material for their clothing. The land was absolutely necessary to the survival of the Cherokee people, and it was considered very sacred. Kentucky was part of that sacred ground, not just to the Cherokee, but to all the surrounding tribes. All of them believed that it was a place for all the tribes to come together to hunt, and it was necessary for the survival of all the tribes. Now, first I'm going to start off a little bit about Dragging Canoe's childhood. Not a whole lot is known, but what that is known is kind of fascinating. He was born about 1730 in the town of Ta-Nehisi in the Cherokee Overhill settlements. Now, Ta-Nehisi gave its name to the state of Tennessee. He was born to a peace chief named Attakullakulla and his wife Neone. Now, the next thing we know about his childhood was that he contracted smallpox in the 1738 outbreak. This was recorded as being one of the worst smallpox outbreaks in the country. Many people were so horribly disfigured that they were killing themselves instead of living with those disfigurements. But this was one of the first times that we know of the determination of Dragging Canoe to carry on. He survived the smallpox epidemic despite the fact his face was horribly scarred. There was one of his contemporaries painted a portrait of him in the 1700s that even shows the smallpox scars on his face. The next thing that we do know, and the last thing we know about his childhood, was how he got the name Dragging Canoe. Now, when he got smallpox, his name wasn't Dragging Canoe. Dragging Canoe was a name that came when he was about 12 years old. His father and some warriors were going to go on the war party, and 12-year-old Dragging Canoe wanted to go with them. But his father says, no, you're not old enough and you're not strong enough, you can't go. This shows another story that shows Dragging Canoe's determination. He ran down before the war party, got down to the river and hid in one of the dugout canoes. Well, his father found him there. So his plan of sneaking off with them until it was too late didn't work. And his father looked at him and said, if you can drag one of those canoes down to the water, you can go with us. Now, dugout canoes can weigh up to 800 pounds. Well, this 12-year-old boy gets out there and starts pulling on the canoe, and it's not budging, but he doesn't give up. He keeps pulling. The warriors start cheering him on, and all of a sudden the canoe starts to move. The warriors then started to scream out, Giugassini, Giugassini, which means the canoe, he is dragging it. He didn't make it to the water, but he did earn a name that day, and that's where his name Dragging Canoe came from. One of the next things I'm going to talk about from his life is when he was an adult and he was an established warrior. He was very well known among his people and very powerful. People were willing to follow him. The European settlers wanted to talk about a treaty at Sycamore Shoals where they wanted to get a big chunk of Kentucky from him. Well, Dragon Canoe had seen how land was being lost left and right and treaties being broken. So he stood up and told them, no, you know, this isn't going to happen. And he stood up before everybody and he started, made a speech. I'm not going to do the whole speech, but I'm going to cover the beginning and the end of it. The beginning of his speech, he said, "Whole nations have melted away like snowballs in the sun before the advancement of the white man." And then he continues to go on and talk about how many great nations were no longer around, and other great nations were now nothing but a name. And he continued to talk about how the land would continually be taken from them until eventually there's nowhere for the Cherokee to go, and there'd be no choice but to wipe them off the face of the earth. So he ended his speech at this meeting with, "This treaty may be good for men too old to hunt and fight, but as for me, I have my warriors about me. We will keep the land." Now, the land he was referring to was eastern Tennessee and eastern Kentucky for the Henderson Purchase. His father was in favor of this treaty, but Dragon Canoe wasn't. Now, his father and a few other chiefs signed away this land on a treaty, but had no legal right to, because the Cherokee Nation as a whole said, no, we don't want to get rid of any more land. But despite that, Dragon Canoe would not concede. He told the whites, if you all attempt to settle Kentucky, you will find it a dark and bloody endeavor. This is where the term Kentucky being a dark and bloody ground comes from. And he kept his word. For the next 17 years, he devoted his whole life to fighting and keeping the land. This was in 1775, and it was also the start of the Chickamauga Wars. Now, the Chickamauгans were a branch of the Cherokee that followed Dragon Canoe and broke away from the tribe and settled on Chickamauga Creek. They were not willing to make treaties or give up land. They were known to attack settlements throughout the entire eastern United States. Many tribes had joined up with the Chickamauгans, and even up in Maine, if there was an attack up there, there were Chickamauгans with them, encouraging them to attack and attacking with them. Many tribes came down to the Chickamauga Creek and joined with them. In fact, he was the influence of a young Shawnee boy whose father had brought him down to join the Chickamauгans. His name was Tecumseh. Tecumseh brought this fight and continued it all the way through the early 1800s, even after the Chickamauga Wars were over. Dragon Canoe died on March 1st, 1792, while celebrating a victory of the Chickamauгans had. He was dancing the warrior dance when apparently his heart gave out on him. The people mourned and buried him, but they continued to fight on for another 2 years before peace was finally made. Now, contemporaries and historians have referred to him as the Dragon, the savage Napoleon, and just murderer. But is it savage or murderous to defend your land, to defend the life of your people and your families? I don't think so. His determination carried his people on during that time of war. How much more land would have been gone if it hadn't been for Dragon Canoe and the Chickamauгans? Now, in closing, I would like you all to think about the two questions I asked you at the very beginning. What would you do if your towns were being attacked and burned? What would you do if peace was always failing despite how much you tried? Think about those questions. Would your answers be the same? Thank you.